بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So as we mentioned after the prayer, continuing with Al-Arba'in fi Usul al-Din by Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, and previously we looked at the section on fasting and the section on prayer, and so today or this early evening we're going to look at the section which begins on Tazkiyatul Qalb, so the purification of the heart, and he starts with hunger and the benefits of hunger. So we're going to see inshallah why hunger is something which is a benefit to us and how it relates to fasting in the sense of acquiring taqwa, etc. So he says rahimahullah ta'ala, القسم الثالث في تزكية القلب عن الأخلاق المذمومة. قال الله تعالى قد أفلح من تزكى وقال تعالى قد أفلح من زكاها والتزكية هي التطهير. So he starts by mentioning the verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says قد أفلح من تزكى, that the person who, and he we'll mention prior to the verse, he says that tazkiyah here means tathir. So the verse literally means the person who purifies themselves have acquired falah, and falah is the best of the dunya and the akhirah. Falah is success in this life and in the next. He says قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the ayah, the person who purifies himself has acquired again success in this life and in the next. And we'll come to see why purification of the self equals or translates to success in this life before the next. We'll come to see that inshallah, but it's a point to reflect upon. Why would a person who spends time purifying their heart and their soul, etc., why would this person be considered successful in this life? Prior to reading what Imam al-Ghazali says, then he says وَقَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهِ وسلم الطُّهُورُ شَطْرُ الْإِيمَانِ, that purification is half of Iman. And so some of the scholars, they say here that at-tuhur, the purification mentioned here is purification literally and purification metaphorically. So purification of the heart, purification of the soul, purification of the body, etc. It's half of Iman. And then he says فَافْهَمْ مِنْهُ أَنَّ كَمَالَ الْإِيمَانِ بِتَزْكِيَةِ الْقَلْبِ عَمَّا لَا يُحِبُّهُ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ, that the completeness of Iman comes about when a person purifies themselves from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is displeased with. The purity of Iman comes when a person purifies their inner self as well as the outer self. How do we purify our outer selves? We purify our bodies, our clothing, the place that we pray. We purify ourselves via praying, giving charity, etc. But he says completeness of Iman comes about when a person also focuses on purity of the inner self. When we focus on the purity of the inner self, we acquire completeness in Iman, because there are inner states that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is displeased with, such as arrogance, such as showing off, such as looking down upon others, and so on and so forth. Then he says وَتَحْلِيَتِهِ بِمَا يُحِبُّهُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى, so to remove oneself from, or to remove that which is displeasing to Allah from oneself, and to fill oneself with that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's like a vessel. Prior to filling the vessel up with something pure, you have to first clean it of the impurities, so that those impurities don't contaminate the purity that you place into the vessel. Likewise our hearts, especially when we're living in a sick society. When we look at when we look to society today, we find there are many sicknesses, and we are a part of that society as individuals and as a collective. Therefore, we are going to be affected by those same sicknesses that we see in society. Sometimes we might even look down upon certain sicknesses in society, not realizing that we ourselves have been contaminated with those illnesses and ailments. So just as today we have everyone wearing masks and social distancing, etc., from a tangible sickness that we fear we can become sick and potentially pass away from, there are sicknesses which are not tangible. We cannot physically touch these sicknesses. You can see the signs and the symptoms of these sicknesses when you look to people, you look to society, but you can't touch these sicknesses. But if we catch those sicknesses and we don't tend to them and try to cure those sicknesses, they can lead to the death of our hearts, which will lead to the destruction of our dunya and our akhirah. Therefore, focusing on purification of the heart is so important. And today, again, society is a society wherein sicknesses are being deemed as praiseworthy traits, selfishness, always trying to make as much as possible, greed and fame and so on and so forth, which if we have time, we'll come to see some of these, not today, but some of the sicknesses at a later date. He says, فَالتَّزْكِيَةُ شَطْرُ الْإِيمَانِ وَكَيْفَ يَشْتَغِلُ بِالطَّهَارَةِ مَنْ لَا يَعْرِفُ النَّجَاسَةِ. He says that purification is half of Iman, but how can a person who doesn't know impurity possibly purify himself? Therefore, he's going to mention the sicknesses so that we can identify them and purify ourselves from them. He says, فلنذكر الأخلاق المذمومة وهي كثيرة ولكن ترجع شعبها إلى 10 أصول. He says that we are going to mention the sicknesses, the illnesses of the self, and they are many, but they are based upon 10 foundations, if you like. So if a person can rectify these foundations, these 10 foundations, then he can rectify many illnesses which stem from these foundations. So he says, الأصل الأول في الطعام. So food. So of course this relates to us as fasting because we're abstaining from food. Let's see what he says, because for many people don't take food into consideration when we talk about practicing Islam, other than is it halal, is it madhbuh, and so on and so forth. He says, وهو من الأمهات العظيمة الضرر في الدين لأن المعدة ينبوع الشهوات. So if we can just understand this first sentence, we understand where he's going with food. He says it is from the basically the foremost reasons for illnesses within the body, i.e. Spiritual illnesses. Why? Because the stomach is the spring from which desires come forward. So all of our desires stem basically from the stomach. How so? We can see now when we're fasting, as he's going to mention, that our desires for intimacy are broken. Our desires for a lot of physical action are broken. Our desires for many things become weakened when we're fasting, because we're not giving ourselves the fuel that pushes us and drives us towards those things. So he's going to say, إذ منها تتشعب شهوة الفرج ثم إذا غلبت شهوة المأكول والمنكوح انشعب منها شهوة وهي حب المال إذ لا يتوصل إلى قضاء الشهوتين إلا به ويتشعب من شهوة المال شهوة الجاه إذ يعسر كسب المال دونه. So he says, firstly, that from the desire of the stomach comes the desire of the private part, i.e. when you're full up, when you've filled your stomach, then you start to think about the desires of the private part, intimacy and attraction to the opposite gender, etc. Then he says, ثم إذا غلبت شهوة المأكول والمنكوح انشعب منها شهوة وهي حب المال. That once you've done with your food and your drink and your physical desires, another desire comes forward, and that's the desire of wealth. Why? He says because you cannot acquire food and drink and in most cases a spouse or intimacy with the other except through acquirement of wealth. He says وَيَتَشَعَبُ مِنْ شَهْوَةِ الْمَالِ شَهْوَةُ الْجَاهِ. And from the desire of having wealth, the desire of status then appears. Why? Because it's difficult to acquire money if you don't have status, if you don't have some sort of CV to present to the people, etc. So he's showing how all of these desires stem from desire of the stomach. He says, ثم عند حصول المال والجاه وطلبهما تزدحم الآفات كلها كالكبر والرياء والحسد والحقد والعداوة وغيرها ومنبع جميع ذلك البطن. So he says, and from there you have all of the different types of illnesses such as he says arrogance and showing off and jealousy for the others and hatred of others and competing with others, but negative type of competing. Why? Because this person has more money than you, this person has greater status than you, this person you want to prove that you're better than him, and so on and so forth. And so all of these illnesses start to come about. And then he says, so all of that comes from the stomach. فلهذا عظم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أمر الجوع فقال ما من عمل أحب إلى الله تعالى من الجوع والعطش وقال لا يدخل ملكوت السماء من ملأ بطنه وقال سيد الأعمال الجوع وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام الفكر نصف العبادة وقلة الطعام هي العبادة. So he mentioned some statements attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, and I say attributed because they could perhaps be weak statements, but indicating that there is virtue in hunger. He says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام أفضلكم عند الله تعالى أطولكم جوعا وتفكرا وأبغضكم إلى الله تعالى كل أكول شروب نؤوم. So he mentions a statement attributed to the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام that the best of you with Allah are those who are able to sustain hunger for the longest, and those of you who are able to contemplate for the longest, and the most disliked of you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who overfill their stomachs, overdrink, and spend a lot of time sleeping. And sleeping and drinking comes from eating too much. If you eat too much, you need to drink a lot. And when you eat and drink a lot, you need to sleep a lot. So having a small amount of food is better. And as I said, these statements, they could possibly be weak or very weak in fact. That's why I say they're attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. Then he says, وَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ مَا مَلَأَ ابْنُ آدَمَ وِعَاءً شَرًّا مِنْ بَطْنِهِ. And this is a statement very well known of the Prophet ﷺ. He said, there isn't a vessel or a place more evil that has been filled by the son of Adam than his stomach. And when we look today to medical science, we find most of the ailments that we suffer from come from the stomach. Diabetes, blood pressure, even various types of cancers now fueled by sugars and so on and so forth, processed fats and things like this, all coming from the stomach. So literally the hadith can be applied to the spiritual side and to the physical side. Then he says, حسب ابن آدم لقيمات يقمن صلبه وإن كان لا محالة فثلث لطعامه وثلث لشرابه وثلث لنفسه. That it will suffice the son of Adam to have luqaymat, so a small amount of food, small portions of food that aid him in keeping his back up straight. That's it. He says, and if he can't suffice on that, then let him fill a third of his stomach with food, a third with drink, and leave another third for air. So we should reflect over today's advice, the advice that we receive, that a person should have 3 meals a day, and sometimes they'll say 3 meals and snacks and so on and so forth. The Prophet ﷺ and the companions were the best of men, and they would eat sparingly, as has been mentioned many times. Aisha anha, she said after the battle of Khaybar that they had finally filled their stomachs on dates and barley or wheat, but yet they were the strongest of generations, physically, spiritually, and so we should reflect over the way that we live our lives. In the West, we are very, very, very entitled. We have a self-entitled nature, and we are spoiled. We eat a lot, and we drink a lot, and we expect a lot, and we complain about everything. Even though we have everything available to us, we still complain about it. We complain about the lack of certain ingredients. This is not salty enough, this isn't spicy enough, this is too spicy, this is too salty, this is too oily, this isn't what I wanted today, I don't feel like having this today, and so on and so forth. But we look around the world and there are people that don't have any food. They are sufficing themselves with whatever they can find. And this is another illness that comes from overeating, that you become accustomed to the spoiledness that we have become accustomed to, and it leads to self-entitlement, assuming that we should have these things. So then he says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام إن الشيطان ليجري من ابن آدم مجرى الدم فضيقوا مجاريه بالجوع والعطش. So the hadith which we mentioned previously when discussing fasting, that shaitan, he runs through the veins of the son of Adam. So he runs through our veins. He uses our our veins as a way to get to our heart and influence us. So the Prophet ﷺ says, فَضَيِّقُوا عَلَيْهِ مَجَارِيَهُ. So restrict and constrict the medium that he has to your heart, which is by abstaining from eating and drinking. And he's not speaking about fasting here. He's speaking about everyday life. Al-Ghazali here, he's speaking about abstaining from a large amount of food as a way of living, sufficing on very little. In Bidayat al-Hidayah, for example, he says if you can suffice yourself on a piece of bread and some oil daily, then you'll live the best of lives. Why? Because you don't have many expectations. You're not going to have much ham and gham, so you won't be depressed and over concerned with where you're getting your next meal from, because you can live off a piece of bread. Of course, that's in his context. In our context, maybe not a piece of bread, but the point being staple food, something simple that you can eat every single day. Then he says, here he says في بيان فوائد الجوع لعلك تشتهي أن تعلم السر في تعظيم الجوع ووجه مناسبته لطريق الآخرة. So he says now, perhaps speaking to the reader, you would like to know the reason for the virtue of hunger. Why is it so virtuous, and what's the benefit behind hunger? He says فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ لَهُ فَوَائِدَ كَثِيرًا وَلَكِنْ يَرْجِعُ أُصُولُهَا إِلَى 7. So it has many benefits, and there are 7 which form the foundation for the benefits. He says إحداها صفاء القلب ونفاذ البصيرة. He says the basically cleanliness or the purity of the heart. The صفاء القلب is basically when the heart is it's like metal that has been shined. It's not being weighed down. And he says وَنَفَاذُ الْبَصِيرَةِ, sharpness of sight. When you have a heavy meal, for example, it weighs you down. You can't think properly, you feel tired, etc. But when you are light, you have a sharp mind, you can concentrate. And in fact, people that fast, often they get to a stage where they find it much easier to concentrate and to work when they're fasting, because they have a sharpness of mind, they have a lightness of soul and heart. He says وَيَعْمِيَ الْقَلْبِ قَالَ فَإِنَّ الشَّبَعَ يُورِثُ الْبَلَادَ وَيَعْمِيَ الْقَلْبِ. He says being full, it leads to a state of foolishness and it blinds the heart. قال عليه الصلاة والسلام من أجاع بطنه عظمت فكرته وفطن قلبه. He mentioned the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, attributed again to the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, that he said whoever basically puts his stomach into a state of hunger, his thinking becomes sharp and his heart becomes pure. It goes back to its original pure state. ولا يخفى أن مفتاح السعادة المعرفة ولا تنال إلا بصفاء القلب وتنوره فلذلك كان الجوع قرع باب الجنة. And then Al-Ghazali, he comments, he says that it's very well known that the key to happiness, sa'ada, and when he says sa'ada here, he means as-sa'adatul abadiyya, continual happiness, the real happiness, i.e. happiness in the akhirah. And happiness in the dunya, knowing that you're working for happiness in the akhirah, i.e. that feeling of knowing that you're working to please Allah, sweetness of iman. That's the only happiness, real happiness you can acquire in this dunya. Everything else, perhaps we assume it to be happiness, but it's pleasure, it's momentary. Real happiness comes from being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the true happiness in the akhirah, with the pleasures that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will grant us in Jannah, knowing that we don't have to worry about His punishment. There's no sickness, there's no death, there's no misfortune, there's no depression, no sadness, no ill feelings between one another. That's true happiness. In this dunya, it can't be achieved. He says that this cannot be achieved, true happiness, except with al-ma'rifah. And he means here, ma'rifatullah, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala theoretically, not knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala according to a text in theology. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has names, Allah has attributes, Allah is like this and like, no. He means knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. having a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing Allah in your life, seeing Allah in the creation. He's speaking about the path towards real knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says that for this reason that you cannot achieve knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except with a pure heart, with a polished heart, and a heart full of light. For this reason, he says, the hunger is considered the doorbell of the gate of paradise. If you want to enter into the gate of paradise, you have to knock on the door, and hunger is one of its bells that you can use to knock on the door with. Then he says, الثانية رقة القلب حتى يدرك به لذة المناجاة ويتأثر بالذكر والعبادة. قال الجنيد رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به: يجعل أحدكم بينه وبين الله تعالى مخلاة من الطعام ويريد أن يجد حلاوة المناجاة لله تعالى. So he says the second benefit from hunger is that the heart becomes soft, and with the softness of the heart, the sweetness of calling upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can be felt. And we see this in Ramadan. We see how many of us, we return to the masjid, we come back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we enjoy being in the masjid, we enjoy tarawih, we enjoy the dua, and so on and so forth. Why? Because our hearts have been softened by the emptiness of our stomachs. And it's easier to make dua, it's easier to cry, it's easier to feel the iman, the states of iman, when the heart is empty. And this is from the benefits of hunger. So it's not something which should only relate to Ramadan, but even outside of Ramadan, trying to eat as little as possible. Doesn't mean starving yourself. No, it could be cutting food down to 1 meal a day, for example, 2 meals a day. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to follow the trends that are set for us. We don't have to have breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, etc. No, it might only be dinner, or it might be lunch and a light dinner. In many countries previously, before the globalization effect, they would have a larger lunch and a very light dinner. In some countries, for example, they would have milk for dinner. They wouldn't have a large meal. It would be some milk and maybe a small piece of bread, etc. Then he mentions a statement of Al-Junayd, basically that Junayd is speaking to those around him, to his students from the early righteous and scholars of Islam. He says, you want to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but yet you place in between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically a feeding bag. You know, the bag that they hang on horses and mules, where they are constantly grazing from these bags. Meaning you're not going to be able to achieve it, because this is in between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're filling yourselves with food which will prevent you from reaching Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he says, الثالثة ذل النفس وزوال البطر والطغيان منها فلا تكسر النفس بشيء كالجوع والطغيان داع إلى الغفلة عن الله تعالى وهو باب الجحيم والشقاوة والجوع إغلاق لهذا الباب. So he says the third benefit from hunger is that it breaks the self. It breaks the self and it humbles the self, and it removes from the self the want to be harsh and to oppress, because you become humbled, you become more reserved in your nature. You become calm in your nature. He says, فَلَا تُكْسَرُ النَّفْسُ بِشَيْءٍ كَالْجُوعِ, and nothing breaks the self like hunger. A person who's hungry for a few days, he's not going to be the same energetic and oppressive person as he would be had he filled his stomach. And we see this in Ramadan. We're all very, very reserved. We calm down in our nature, etc. The benefits of hunger. He says, وَالطُّغْيَانُ دَاعٍ إِلَى الْغَفْلَةِ عَنِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, and being in a state of wantonness, oppression towards others, it's a caller to ghafla, to being oblivious to the state of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whereas hunger, it reminds us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, he used to prefer poverty over wealth, and he used to enjoy hunger. Why? Because the poor person doesn't know where his next meal is coming from, and so he's always reliant upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is always on his mind and his heart. Whereas the rich person is dependent upon his own wealth. He might remember that the wealth comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every now and again, but he doesn't wake up in the morning questioning where things are going to come from. He doesn't wake up in the morning with a hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like the poor person does. And this affects us today in the systems that we live in. We become very, very dependent upon the systems, upon our bank accounts, upon the money that we receive at the end of the month, whether it's through a job, whether it's through a welfare system, whether it's through whatever other means. We become dependent upon the system. Likewise, our travel, we become dependent upon the systems. Our technologies, we become dependent upon the systems. And slowly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is removed from our hearts. So being in a state of hunger, it can remind us of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but more so a state of poverty. And of course, it's not that we should wish for poverty, we should wish for that which is best for us. A person should always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that which is best for him. A person may want to be wealthy, but they don't know that wealth will destroy them. And a person may want for poverty, but they don't know that poverty will destroy them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from His mercy, He gives wealth to the one who wealth is good for and going to benefit him. And He gives poverty to the one who poverty is good for. And according to the lens of today, we see this as an injustice. We see this as an injustice. Why is it that this person is rich and this person is poor? Everyone should have an equal amount of this dunya. But that's not the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from His mercy, decrees wealth for those whom wealth is going to aid in achieving a good akhirah, and poverty for those whom poverty is going to aid in achieving a good akhirah. And for those that Allah gives wealth to and it destroys them, this again is from the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And for those whom Allah gives poverty to and it destroys them, again from the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we should always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that which is best for us. We should always ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that which is best for us, and try to learn to be content with whatever Allah has given us. It doesn't mean that we remain at home. It doesn't mean that we don't have ambition and drive to achieve, etc. But ultimately, we should be cautious, and we should always ask Allah to give us that which is best for us. All of our positions, our statuses, they've been given to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, the fuqara will enter into paradise 50,000 years before the wealthy. Who would want to be from the wealthy on that day? On Yawm al-Qiyamah, there are going to be individuals that are going to be taken to Jannah. The Prophet ﷺ said, not literally, but people taken to Jannah in chains. They're chained up and they're taken into Jannah. How so? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala afflicts them in this life. So much so that the afflictions lead to paradise for these people. They don't have the good deeds to reach high stations of paradise, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala afflicts them and drags them to Jannah in chains, i.e. those afflictions. But we might look at a person and say this person is suffering. We're in a better state than this person. When we look at the news, for example, we might watch the news and we see people suffering. We see people nowadays with images and technology, you can see the suffering of people all over the world. And we might say, look at these people and say, Alhamdulillah alladhi afani. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected me from such a suffering. On Yawm al-Qiyamah, perhaps those people will be far, 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 far beyond us. And we will wish that we suffered like they suffered. Imam Malik rahmahullah, he said, don't ever look to a person and say, I wish I was in his place. Because you may on Yawm al-Qiyamah, when suffering, you may on Yawm al-Qiyamah see the reward for your suffering and your patience in your suffering, and wish that you suffered even more. So, although it's off the topic, but relating to poverty and wealth, learning to be content and seeing things from the perspective of the akhirah rather than the perspective of the dunya is so important. He says, الرابعة أن البلاء من أبواب الجنة. So linking to what we were saying, that trial is from the gates of paradise. لأن فيه مشاهدة طعم العذاب وبه يعظم الخوف من عذاب الآخرة ولا يقدر الإنسان على أن يعذب نفسه بشيء كالجوع فإنه لا يحتاج فيه إلى تكلف وترتبط بها فوائد أخرى فيكون مشاهدا بلاء الله تعالى على الدوام وذلك يدعو إلى الرحمة والإطعام والشبعان في غفلة عن ألم الجائع. So he says that in hunger you suffer, and suffering is a door to paradise. And when you are suffering, you taste the punishment, and through tasting that punishment, it gives you even more fear of the punishment of what is waiting for those who disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So imagine now we're suffering from hunger and we're suffering from thirst. Imagine in Jahannam, in the hellfire, those who have been, they are surrounded by fire. They are so thirsty, and what do they have to drink? Boiling water. Imagine now the only thing we have to break our fast, boiling water. You start to imagine and start to feel the pain that, of course, we cannot comprehend the pain of and all the pleasure of the akhirah, but we start to try to conceptualize. Likewise, he says, you start to appreciate the suffering of others. We're here, we're fasting now for how many hours? I'm not too sure. Perhaps 16 hours roughly this year, 16 hours a day. There are those that have no food, no drink. This is a common way of living for them. They're concerned about their children. They have no food, no drink for their children. But yet we in our homes, we're throwing food away after we've broken our fast because we haven't been able to finish it. We throw food away on a regular basis. You go behind supermarkets and they're throwing food away because it has on it an expiry date. But in reality, there's nothing wrong with that food. It can be eaten. But we're living in, as was mentioned previously, spoiled and self-entitled states of a society. So through fasting, we should learn to appreciate suffering and the suffering of others. And this should lead us to being more loose with our wealth, i.e. spending for the poor, and so on and so forth. He says, وَالْخَامِسَةُ وَهِيَ مِنْ كِبَارِ الْفَوَائِدِ كَسْرُ سَائِرِ الشَّهَوَاتِ التي هي منابع المعاصي والاستيلاء على النفس الأمارة بالسوء قال ذو النون رضي الله تعالى عنه ما شبعت قط إلا عصيت أو هممت بمعصية. So he says, from the biggest of benefits of hunger, which is the fifth, he says, is that it breaks the other desires, as we mentioned. So the desires of the private part, desires of the hand, desires of the pocket, desires of the eyes, and so on and so forth. And he mentions a statement by Dhul Noon al-Misri, radhiallahu anhu. He was known as a very pious man from the early generations. He says that this statement of Dhul Noon, I didn't fill my stomach once except that I sinned. He's saying every time I filled my stomach, I ended up falling into sin of some type. And so for us, when we say sin, perhaps we would think of real big sins. But for these individuals, what we would consider to be, we wouldn't even take them into consideration, to be honest. They would consider these things to be sins. For example, a glance at something which shouldn't be looked at. For us, we stare for minutes and there's no problem. Then he says, أو هممت بمعصية, or I had the urgent desire to sin. The Noon saying this. And so likewise now, I'm sure you can relate to this statement. When you're in a state of hunger, you don't really have that desire to do certain things that you may have the desire to do outside of fasting. So that's the benefit of being in a state of hunger. Then he says, وَأَمَّا شَهْوَةُ الْفَرْجِ فَلَا تَخْفَى غَائِلَتُهَا وَالْجُوعُ يَكْفِي شَرَّهَا. So then he speaks about the desire of the private part, and it's very well known, the evil that it causes, following the desires of the private parts, the lower desires. Look today, generations upon generations of fatherless homes. And look what happens. What happens in a fatherless home? There's no role model for the young men. There's no keeper for the young women. There's no backbone to support the woman who's had these children. And it leads to so many problems. Even if today's society wants to try to act as if a fatherless home is not a big problem, it's a major problem. And if we look to the communities that are suffering now, we find fatherless homes are a common thing in those communities. Many young brothers that end up outside, involved in that which they shouldn't be involved in, they suffer because they're coming from a fatherless home. And a fatherless home is not necessarily a home wherein the father is not present. A fatherless home can be a home wherein the father is present but he's absent. He's present but he's not actually present. He's there in body, but he's not there in mind. He's not there in relationship. He spends most time outside of the home than he does inside of the home. He doesn't have a relationship with the children, etc. And we have to fix this. We have to understand the negative impact that this has on society. And you'll find the more educated a class, the less fatherless homes they have, because they realize the implications of a fatherless home. And so due to that education, they'll keep the home together, even if the parents are suffering. In fact, in some societies, the parents are having illicit relationships and they know about it, but they want to keep the home together. So rectifying our state, we need to understand, and it might be painful for some, but we have to understand the issue of the fatherless home is a major problem. Likewise, the other illnesses that come from a society full of promiscuity, the physical ailments that people are suffering from today, even though they're played down. So, for example, STDs, now referred to as STIs, because STDs is an offensive word, sexually transmitted diseases. So now it's called sexually transmitted infections, because they don't want to admit that these things come from a place of ill behavior. But for us, we have a framework, and we have to express this framework openly and be clear about our framework, because our framework is God-given, and it's one shared by the Christians and the Jews previously, and of course it was changed. Then he says, السادسة خفة البدن للتهجد والعبادة. So I'll quickly run through the rest, inshallah. He says the sixth one is basically the lightness of the body. You find it easier to worship. You find it easier to stand in prayer. You find it easier to recite Quran. There's nothing weighing the body down. Then he says, والسابعة خفة المؤنة. And this is perhaps one of the most important, especially in our time today. He says, خفة المؤنة وإمكان القناعة بقليل من الدنيا وإمكان إيثار الفقر. So he says the lightness of provisions that you require. So if you are a person who you can live in a state of hunger, you've developed the ability to live in a state of hunger, you don't need to worry too much about your provisions. And he says, وَإِمْكَانُ الْقَنَاعَةِ بِقَلِيلٍ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا, and the ability to be content with a small amount of the dunya. For the person who's able to live in a state of content for the small things in the dunya, they're not worried about the big things. They don't mind having a small car, a small flat, a small amount of food, a few items of clothing. For this person, they're not going to suffer from the depression and the issues that come with grand desires and ambitions for acquiring the dunya. Should we have an ambition to acquire this dunya? Yes, for the sake of establishing that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for the sake of the self. As believers, we should use the dunya to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the dunya should be our medium of establishing that which is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But today, the dunya has become a medium for establishing pleasure for ourselves. And that's it, nothing else. We're looking for the best food and the best clothes and the best cars. And for the younger generation, I'm very, very worried, to be honest. Because now, the younger generation, they've started off with the best of clothes and the best of cars and the best of lifestyles. Young children wearing £150 trainers to start off with. Young children, instead of buying a cheap car, when I say young children, in their late teens perhaps, instead of buying a cheap car, which was previously the way that you would start driving, you buy a cheap car, then as you earn more money, you buy a bigger car, etc. They start off with a Mercedes or a BMW or a Lexus or one of these types of cars. How? Financing. So you're setting yourself up from the get-go with the top. So you're not able to start from the bottom. And you condition yourself to thinking that these things are giving you comfort and happiness. But you lose the ability to be content with that which is lesser in value. Likewise with clothing, spending 400, 500, 600 pounds on a single jacket, when yet there are hundreds of people starving, in thousands in fact, in the UK. We have, for many of us, our fathers come from lands where There are people suffering beyond what we can comprehend, but yet we're going to spend 400, 500, 600 pounds on a jacket, a few £100 on a pair of trainers because they're rare, or because they're a collector's edition. That this is an excusable behavior. As Muslims, we cannot excuse this behavior. We have to be honest with ourselves. Likewise, when it comes to technology, spending £500 on a pair of headphones, what benefit do we get from those headphones? We're going to hear the same sounds that we hear when we spend £10 on a pair of headphones. Okay, noise cancellation. Spend £50 and you'll get the noise cancellation too. But we spend £500. Why? Because these items become designer items. So we have to be reflective about the lifestyles that we live. If a person is extremely wealthy, wherein spending £500 on a pair of headphones is like spending £5 to £10 on a pair of headphones for the average person, that's different, because he's not actually living a luxurious lifestyle per se. That's within his bracket, and this person could be spending thousands of pounds on charity and so on and so forth. But for the average person who has an average salary, we have to reflect over the way we spend our money and the way that we condition ourselves to live. We have to be content with little. Likewise, sisters are the same as brothers, and sisters are always looking for a good man, etc. The good men in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, many of them were poor. They were poor because they were too busy working for the akhirah. They weren't poor because they were stuck at home and they didn't want to work. It's not to excuse that a man stays at home and doesn't want to work, or a man stays at home and wants to play PlayStation all day, doesn't want to earn a living for his family. No, the Sahaba were poor because they were busy working for the akhirah, supporting the Prophet ﷺ, trying to establish that which was pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the women, they were also doing the same thing. And so they were patient with the men who didn't have that much. Aisha anha, she said that there was hardly a fire in our homes, i.e. the wives of the Prophet ﷺ's homes. There was hardly a fire, meaning there was hardly ever cooked food. They were able to live on that which was the bare minimum. And that's an ideal. It's an ideal. It's not to say that we should all be living like that, but it's an ideal. We should aspire to live like that. The standard that we should not but allow ourselves to drop below is to make sure that we're eating from the halal, make sure we're not overeating. We're not overeating and we're not overfilling ourselves, and to make sure that we're not living outside of our bracket, outside of what we can actually afford. And for the younger brothers, spending hundreds of pounds on items of clothing and things like this, this is something that should be reflected over. Imagine you spend a few £100s on a pair of trainers. They last how long? A year, 2 years, maybe. If you were to spend a fraction of that on a pair of trainers and you give the rest in charity, you meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you have something waiting for you. You spend £500 on a pair of headphones. Why not split the money and buy headphones for you and your family, you and your friends? There are much better ways to spend our money than to be fooled into following the latest trends and becoming a means of profit for someone else's pocket. And these companies now, they are focused on our desires. They mine our data, trying to find out what makes us tick, so that they can try to make as much money from us as possible. And when we add to that as well, companies like Nike, Adidas, Zara, Apple, all of the big brands, Puma, they are producing clothing in very oppressive ways. Puma, if I'm not mistaken, they were producing clothing and supporting the oppression against Palestinians. Adidas and Nike lobbying the American government to prevent them from banning imports from China, from concentration camps in China. So our Muslim brothers and sisters in China, in forced concentration camps, being forced to produce clothing for Nike and Adidas, according to what this suggests. Likewise, Apple did the same, and workers. You can read, you can do the research. Workers in in apple factories killing themselves because they're forced to work 12-hour shifts, etc. And then when we think about, we speak about now the oppression of the West in its history, the colonization and enslavement of masses, etc. The state that we're living in now, the systems that we're living in now, we are fueling these things in other places, because these things are taking place because of our demand. If our demand isn't there, then the market won't be there. So we have to think about Islam and the way we practice Islam on a deeper level. And the only reason why we're here and we're not in places where we would perhaps be forced to labor, maybe not physically, but forced by our circumstance, earning a few dollars a day, having to try to feed our entire family. The only difference is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So being grateful for that mercy is to assess ourselves, reflect over the way we live, utilize the wealth that Allah has given us to benefit others, because we may be questioned about these things, and it's a very scary thought to think about. So we'll end with that, inshallah. If there are any questions or comments, then feel free, bi'idhnillah. No. طيب, so I'll see you back at Maghrib, inshallah. Barakallah. Barakallah.